Heute ist es auf den Tag 99 Tage her, seit der Krieg in der Ukraine ausgebrochen ist. Morgen werden es 100 Tage sein, seit der Invasion russischer Truppen im Nachbarland. Und es sterben weiterhin laut Präsident Volodymyr Zelensky 100 Soldaten pro Tag. Vor 100 Tagen ist etwas passiert, das wir alle nicht für möglich hielten. Weniger als 3 Flugstunden von hier entfernt herrscht Krieg in Europa. Und wir sind ratlos und wir fragen uns, was wir alle dagegen tun können, was uns in Europa eint, was uns bleibt in diesem Kampf gegen den Krieg. Und man spricht oft von einer Zeitenwende, historisch gesehen. Der Herr Bundespräsident hat es auch angesprochen. Wenn wir zurückdenken, da war ja auch schon mal von einer Zeitenwende die Rede. 1989, als der Eiserne Vorhang fiel, die kommunistischen Länder sich auflösten in Richtung Demokratie, zumindest einige von ihnen. Und wir waren alle schon ein bisschen euphorisch. Francis Fukuyama war sogar so euphorisch, dass er das Ende der Geschichte ausrief, gesagt hat, jetzt gehen wir in eine neue Epoche. Die Demokratie, die Globalisierung wird uns Positives, Gutes bringen. Und jetzt stehen wir hier, 33 Jahre später, und wir merken, die Geschichte ist nicht einfach fertig, sie endet nicht einfach, sondern sie geht weiter. Und sie geht zum Teil weiter in Bahnen und in Wegen, die wir uns nicht vorstellen konnten. Jemand, der diese letzten 33 Jahre ganz konkret und ganz nahe mitverfolgt hat, ist unsere kommende Referentin. Sie ist eine Pulitzer-Preisträgerin, Journalistin, Autorin, die 1989 den Fall des Eisernen Vorhangs ganz persönlich miterlebt hat in Polen. Und sie schreibt seitdem über Osteuropa, über Russland und ist eine der erwiesensten Expertinnen, wenn es darum geht, das, was im Moment in der Ukraine und vor allem auch in der Russland passiert, einzuschätzen und uns vielleicht auch die Hintergründe mitzugeben, damit wir eben besser verstehen, was da los ist und was vielleicht wir dagegen tun könnten. Wir sind sehr froh, dass Sie heute hier. Please give a very warm Interlaken welcome to Anne Applebaum.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to be speaking to you at a moment of great significance. It's a moment when we here in Europe and in North America are at a particularly dangerous time. As you may know, the largest European war in many decades is at a turning point. The Russian military expected that their conquest of all of Ukraine would last no more than 6 weeks. But although twice that amount of time has passed, there is no evidence that it has decided to retreat. The Ukrainians, meanwhile, will not give up. Their lives, their property, their culture is at stake. Their very existence is at stake. Yet neither side can fight forever. So what should the end game be? What is the goal for Ukraine and for the rest of us? Here's my answer. For the sake of all of us and for the future of everyone in this room and everyone in this country and everyone on this continent, that goal should not be a truce or an immediate ceasefire or a frozen conflict. That goal should be a victory for Ukraine. By using the word victory, I'm imagining something very specific. So in the case of victory, Ukraine remains a sovereign democracy with the right to choose its own leaders and to make its own treaties. The Russian army retreats back over the borders. Maybe there could be changes to those borders or other compromises, but that is for the Ukrainians to decide and not for outsiders to suggest. Some kind of permanent security guarantee then needs to be put in place. In any case, Ukraine must have a reason to believe that Russian troops will not quickly return. Ukrainians must have a reason to go home, to cease to be refugees, and to rebuild their country. Russia must abandon its imperial mission and cease to think of itself as a colonial power. like other European powers that gave up the idea of empire decades ago, Russia should now join them. This kind of victory would have profound consequences. In Washington, and I suspect Zurich and Bern and Basel too, most people have long believed that Ukraine is part of a regional conflict, that the Ukrainian-Russian argument is somehow local, or that Ukraine is a piece of territory that Russians care more about than we do, and always will. But this is no longer true. Firstly, this is because the Ukrainians, and especially their president, President Zelensky, have given this conflict universal and global implications by arguing that they fight for a set of ideas. For democracy, yes, but also for a form of civic nationalism based on patriotism, on liberal values, on the rights to freedom of speech and assembly, and above all, respect for the rule of law. This language is effective because it appeals to the principles that bind together not only most Europeans and North Americans, but also the members of the democratic opposition in Russia, in Cuba, in Iran, in Burma, or Hong Kong. Their struggle is ours, a Venezuelan friend told me a few weeks ago. A victory for Ukraine is a victory for all of them, as well as for the institutions created to protect the states that embody those same ideas, most notably the European Union and NATO. But Zelensky's words also resonated because the Russians have given this conflict universal and global implications too. So the Russian foreign minister has declared that this war will change global politics. This is not about Ukraine at all, but about the world order, said Sergei Lavrov. And indeed, the Russian occupation of some of the eastern Ukrainian towns does represent a profound change. It's an attack on a whole array of treaties and agreements, from the Geneva Convention to the UN statements on human rights and genocide. It resembles, I'm afraid to say, both the Nazi and the Soviet occupations of Central Europe in the 1940s. Public officials and civic leaders, mayors, police, but also members of parliament, journalists, museum curators, cultural leaders have been arrested and murdered. Civilians have been deported en masse to Russia. The Russians have, just as they did in the 1930s, decided to use food as a weapon once again. So they are blocking the export of grain so that Africa and the Middle East will starve, deliberately creating poverty and refugees. Putin and his propagandists are also dropping hints about chemical and nuclear weapons for the same reason. Why? Because they want to send us all messages. They want us to know that the world we have spent our lives in, the world shaped by international institutions and international law, a world of open international trade and travel, a world in which the borders of Europe, at least, are sacrosanct, in which conferences like this one take place in safety, this world is coming to an end. Putin, in other words, is showing us a different future, one without rules, one where small countries like Ukraine or indeed Switzerland are not safe. But instead of fear, this language should inspire us to imagine a different future, a future that includes a Ukrainian victory. And it should particularly inspire you here in Switzerland. Let me explain what I mean. But in this different future, we will have to face some hard facts. And one of those is that there is no such thing as a natural liberal world order. There are no rules unless there is someone to enforce them. So unless democracies defend themselves, the forces of autocracy will destroy them. And I'm using the word forces here in the plural deliberately. Many American politicians would understandably prefer to focus on the long-term competition with China. But as long as Russia is ruled by Putin or by people who share his imperial views, then Russia is at war with us too. And so are Belarus and North Korea and Venezuela and Iran and Nicaragua and potentially others. We might not want to compete with them or even care very much about them, but they care about us. They understand that the language of democracy, of anti-corruption, and of justice is dangerous to their form of autocratic power, and they know that that language originates in the democratic world, in our world. So this fight is not theoretical. On the one hand, it requires armies and strategies and weapons and long-term plans. It requires a NATO that can no longer operate as if it might someday be required to defend itself. It needs to start operating as it did during the Cold War, on the assumption that an invasion could happen at any time. Germany's decision to raise its defense spending by 100 billion euros is a good start, but deeper military and intelligence coordination might also require deeper changes. Already 2 formerly neutral states, Sweden and Finland, have recognized that there can be no such thing as neutrality anymore, and they have announced that they will join the alliance. Could it be time for others to join them as well? No. Does Switzerland want to pretend that it has no interest in the outcome of these coming clashes? You in Switzerland have a famously well-trained army. You have decades of experience in thinking about self-defense. Isn't this the time to begin thinking about how to use that experience to help Ukraine win and ultimately to preserve the European peace that has made your country so prosperous? Of course, the coming struggle will have an economic component too. And by this, I don't merely mean sanctions against Russia, and I should say I'm really grateful for Switzerland's decision to join the European sanctions, as your president has just said. Though unfortunately, I believe these will last for a long time, or again, as long as Russia's war in Ukraine, as long as Russia maintains its colonial posture towards its region. But I also mean the broader fight against global kleptocracy. As it turns out, trade with autocrats does not produce more democracy or even peace. So Wandel durch Handel was a myth. Indeed, by inviting kleptocrats to use our financial systems and to buy into our property markets, we have increased criminality, we have deepened poverty in their countries, and we have made war more likely around the world. Is that what we want? Maybe if we want to reduce that poverty, if we want to reduce that criminality, we should add ethical considerations to our investments, and we should set some new rules as well. We should, for example, consider immediately making all ownership transparent. Tax havens should be illegal. Shell companies should be a thing of the past. Future Swiss governments should not wait to apply sanctions to resident kleptocrats, but should rather make it impossible for them to live here and to hide their stolen money here in the first place. We need a dramatic and profound shift in our energy consumption, and not only because of climate change. So the billions of dollars that we've sent to Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia have promoted some of the worst and most corrupt dictatorships in the world. So the transition from oil and gas to other energy sources needs to happen with far greater speed and decisiveness. Every dollar spent on Russian oil helps fund the artillery that fires on Ukrainian civilians. So there are countless ways in which Switzerland can contribute to this transformation, and you are doing so already. So thank you. But my hope is that the arguments against carbon-based fuels begin to be made not only by green and progressive politicians, but also by hard-headed business people, by bankers, by people like those in this room who understand very well that the countries empowered by their oil and gas sales are threatening their safety and their livelihoods. Finally, let me end with a thought that I think will be very welcome for you in Switzerland to hear, unlike maybe some of the previous thoughts. And that is about the importance of taking our democracies seriously. So maybe there is no natural liberal world order, but there are liberal societies, there are open and free countries that offer a better chance for people to live useful lives than closed dictatorships do. They are hardly perfect. The one that I was born in, America, has very deep flaws and profound divisions and terrible historical scars. But that's all the more reason to defend and protect them, for them to continue to reach out, as this conference seeks to do. Very few of them have existed across human history. Many have existed for a time and then failed. They can be destroyed from the outside, but from the inside too, by division and by demagogues. Let's prevent that from happening, and many thanks for your attention. Thanks.
So much, Anne. If I can ask you Just in the middle would be fine. Thank you so much for these words, for these ideas. However, one gets the impression to be quite helpless after listening to you. Your new book, highly interesting, shows a world in which we live in less and less democratic states. Less than 50% of the population, world's population, live under democracies. There's a rise of totalitarian regimes. There's a kind of a fascination for anti-democratic movements. Are we on the losing side here?
So even to think that you're on the losing side is a step in the direction of losing. So I am a great believer in optimism. Or as the late Madeleine Albright used to say, I am an optimist who worries a lot. Believing in the strength and the power of our own societies, believing that the places that we live are built on good foundations, and I believe Switzerland is a place built on good foundations, just like the United States and many other democracies. Believing that and then being willing to defend it, as I said, whether militarily or economically or rhetorically in the world. This is a step toward not just preserving what we have, but in convincing others. Too much time over the last several decades we spend criticizing ourselves, and although I'm in favor of that, it's also important to remember that we have something that's very important and that we should seek to preserve it.
Where the cooperation comes to play. We have a lot of questions in the app. One was partly answered by you regarding the NATO and regarding Switzerland and NATO. We heard a very loud no, whoever that was.
Understandably.
I'm going to ask you again, do you think Switzerland should join the NATO?
So I am reluctant to stand in a room full of Swiss people and tell you what to do.
Tell them what to do. So, probably a fair point.
But I hope that the war has at least caused some to consider whether your incredible talent for self-defense, the things that you've learned by organizing your own army, whether you would not be willing to share that and help others defend themselves elsewhere in Europe who are less able to. Whether that's through a direct association with NATO, whether it's through some other institutions, I still have, this really shows I'm an optimist. I still have some hope eventually in some European structures that will be able to do self-defense. I hope you'll consider joining those. And understanding that in this particular kind of conflict, nobody's neutral.
We'll take that as a half yes. Speaking of NATO, Secretary General Stoltenberg was in Davos last week at the WEF, and he said something very interesting. Can we just listen to that one quote from Mr. Stoltenberg?
I think we all have learned a lesson. That of course, and you and I, we have actually been active in Norwegian politics, arguing heavily and strongly in favor of free trade agreements, integration with the European Union, globalization of the economy, and more global trade, a more global economy. Free trade has brought a lot of prosperity and wealth to all of us. But the problem is that it has a price. Because some of this trade, some of this economic interaction with authoritarian regimes is undermining our security.
You alluded to it in your presentation as well. Reaching out is a great thing, and globalization is a great thing, and free trade is a great thing, but it comes, as he says, with a price. Are we, at the moment, at another turning point, maybe at the end of some of these issues he alluded to as well, that maybe we have been too international, maybe we have been too open towards each other? Do we see a new step into kind of getting back to ourselves?
I don't think we're turning back the clock 100 years, but I do think we're at a very important moment where we see a process of de-globalization beginning to happen. You can see it already in the way in which the Russian government has approached sanctions. They have said, right, we're fine with sanctions. We want to be isolated. We want our oligarchs to come home. We don't care if they keep their houses in Geneva. We're willing to be isolated from the world economy. I don't think that should be our position, but I also think that we need to understand that some of that will happen and that some moral thinking about how we engage with the rest of the world might be now necessary. The idea that, as I said in my brief remarks, the idea that merely by trading we will create positive change, which was a nice idea because it meant that we got rich and we did good at the same time. This was wrong. So having some deeper understanding of what it is that trade does, understanding the difference between exchanges of goods that are good for both sides and helping oligarchs launder money so that they can stay in power. We need to understand that these are very different kinds of economic engagement, and we need to limit the latter kind.
Let's speak about Russia, which brings me to another question from the audience. The one big black box at the moment is Vladimir Putin. We don't see him a lot. You get
Nobody
the impression,
does.
Nobody does. We get the impression he lives in an alternative reality, almost. The question from the audience, and I gladly take that over. Can change in Russia, and you know Russia very well, can change in Russia only happen with the end of Putin, and how would that end look like?
So the interesting thing about Putin and Putinism is not only can I not tell you who would replace Putin, I can't tell you who would choose that person. So there is no Politburo, there is no Soviet Communist Party, there are no intermediate institutions. There's the Kremlin and the Kremlin administration, and that's it. So we are, Russia, which has had for centuries a history of succession crises, would have another one were something to happen to Putin. But I do think, again, as I alluded to in my remarks, there are things that we can do, if not to shape Putin, but at least to change the way that Russia thinks about itself. And as I said, one of them would be winning the war in Ukraine. What has to happen in Russia is an abandonment of this imperial policy and an end to this colonial attitude to the rest.
Is that realistic?
There is certainly a part of the Russian opinion spectrum, and there's a part of the Russian political spectrum that would like to do that. Alexei Navalny, who's the imprisoned effective leader of the Russian opposition, has said, I want Russia to be a country where the Russian government thinks about its own prosperity and is not interested in attacking and occupying its neighbors. So, and he does represent a piece of the spectrum, and I believe there are more there. And one of the strange things about Russia right now is that so many people refuse to answer even the questions of pollsters that we don't really know what Russians think. But there is another Russia, there always has been. It may go stronger because of this war, and we have to think about how we would support it if it were ever to take over control of the country.
Which brings us to the question to the aftermath. What happens after, and hopefully soon, that war will end? There are voices claiming the more we alienate Russia now, the more difficult it will become to get on the same table, to get on the same page, to solve problems that are universal, like the climate crisis, for example. Is there a risk of alienating them so much that there will never be a chance anymore to get them back?
So what has to be done now is to convince Russia, the Russian leadership and the Russian people that this war was a mistake. And that, again, the colonialism and imperialism belong to the last century or the one before that. And if what it takes to do that is to alienate or to humiliate it, to use the French president's word, or to separate ourselves from the Russian government, then that's what it takes. I personally don't believe that Putin will give up the chance to talk to foreign leaders. He likes to do it. And nor, by the way, do I think it's wrong. I think anybody who is able or in a position to be a moderator or to be a negotiator should do it, whether it's Macron or the president of Turkey or the prime minister of Israel. I'm very happy for people to intercede and intervene. But we have to remember how we got here. So why did Russia invade Ukraine in 2022? Because after they did so in 2014, they got no reaction. The trade continued as normal, relations continued as normal, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was built, nothing happened. And we can't allow that to happen again.
Does that mean, and you were quite specific at the beginning of your speech that, victory, there needs to be a victory for the Ukraine, but there's so many discussions, what does victory actually mean? When you talk about 2014, would victory for you mean that the Crimea, for example, goes back to the Ukraine as well, and that the old Ukraine will be restored?
So Garry Kasparov, the Russian chess champion and now democracy advocate, has said that he believes Russia will be a normal country when there's a Ukrainian flag flying over Crimea. I'm willing to let the Ukrainians make those decisions about which of their territories, where they want their borders to be. I'm not going to impose that on them. But I do think that the more, understanding that all of the territory occupied by Russia is now the site of massive human rights violations, concentration camps, deportations, murder. We have to understand that those occupied territories are not stable. And so the occupation of whether it's Kherson or whether it's some territories in the east will not bring peace, it will bring further conflict in the future. So the more territory can be returned to Ukraine, the better chance we have of a more stable future.
Final question, and I'm trying to give, at least a kind of a positive spin to this very grim discussion that we have regarding the war in the Ukraine. It's a question from the audience as well. You're a historian. I'm a historian as well, so I'm well aware that this is a difficult question. But do you see any concept, any model, any example in history which could teach us for the future how to prevent something happening like it happened now? You said you're an optimistic person. Give us some optimism at the end, please.
Look, the behavior of the United States during the Cold War is an interesting example and an important one. So why didn't the Soviet Union invade Germany for 40 years? Because there was deterrence, because America put its troops in Europe, because Europeans banded together to create NATO and other institutions, other European institutions, because it was clear that there would be a response, because we created the alliances that made Europe what it is today. What's wrong with deterrence? Tell the bully that if you cross the line, here's what will happen. Make it very, very clear. This is how you prevent violence.
You know what? We take that as a positive.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne Applebaum.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Right. How do I get down?
Please, yes, please.
Okay.